The small church in a neighborhood of Madrid was decorated with white flowers and delicate ribbons that hung from the pews. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, painting the floor in shades of red, blue, and gold. Everything was ready for a perfect wedding. The guests spoke in hushed voices. Some smiled while they took pictures. Others looked toward the door, waiting for the moment the groom would appear. Helen stood by the altar in the white dress she had chosen months ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the bouquet. She had imagined that day hundreds of times, the music, the glances, the instant when she would walk toward a new life. But something was not right. She looked at the clock on the wall again. David should have arrived already, 20 minutes ago. "I'm sure there's traffic," whispered one of her friends, trying to calm her. Helen tried to smile, although deep down she felt an unease that grew little by little. Her mother came closer and tenderly fixed a strand of her hair. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she asked with concern. "Yes, I'm sure he's on his way," Helen answered, although her voice sounded less steady than she wanted. The minutes kept passing. The guests' murmurs changed tone. Some glanced at their phones, others exchanged uncomfortable gestures. The priest approached with a kind but confused expression. "Perhaps there was some delay," he said calmly. "We'll wait a bit longer." Helen nodded, but her heart was beating harder and harder. She felt that every second weighed more than the one before. Then her phone vibrated in her hand. For a moment she hesitated to look at the screen. A part of her feared discovering what she did not want to accept. When she finally read the message, she felt the air leave her lungs. It was David. "I'm sorry, Helen, I can't do this. I'm not ready to get married." The world seemed to stop. Those words were brief, simple, but heavy enough to bring everything crashing down. Helen stood still, staring at the screen as if her mind refused to understand what she had just read. "What happened?" her mother asked when she noticed her expression. Helen slowly lifted her gaze. Her eyes were full of tears that had not yet fallen. "He's not coming," she whispered. Silence spread around her like a shadow. Some guests began to understand what was happening. The murmurs grew. "What do you mean he's not coming? What happened?" "Poor thing." Helen felt every stare fixed on her. Shame, pain, and disbelief mixed in her chest. She took a deep breath. Then, with slow movements, she took off her veil. For a few seconds she held it in her hands, looking at that delicate fabric that symbolized so many dreams. After that she left it on a bench without saying a single word and walked out of the church. Each step felt heavy, as if she were walking inside a strange dream she could not wake from. When she reached the street, the fresh air hit her face. The noise of the city went on just the same as always. Cars passing, people walking, the distant sound of a bus. But for Helen, everything had changed. She wandered for hours through the streets of Madrid. The white dress drew the attention of passers-by, but she barely noticed. Finally, she sat on a bench in a small plaza, looked at the grey afternoon sky, and let out a long sigh. "I suppose life had other plans," she murmured. The days that followed were hard. Helen went from sadness to anger and from anger to silence. She cancelled reservations, returned gifts, and tried to get back to her routine, but she also understood something important. She had to move forward. One morning, while she was looking at job offers on her laptop in a small cafe in the neighborhood, she found an ad that caught her attention. Babysitter wanted to take care of a child. Good salary. Salamanca area. Helen watched the ad for a few seconds. It was not the job she had imagined for her life, but in that moment she needed to start over. She picked up the phone, took a deep breath, and dialed the number. Without knowing it, that simple call was the first step toward a story completely different from the one she had lost. The house was on one of the quiet streets in the Salamanca neighborhood in Madrid. When Helen arrived for the first time, she looked at the building with a certain unease. It was elegant, with black wrought iron balconies and large windows. It did not seem like the kind of place where someone like her usually worked. She breathed deeply before ringing the doorbell. Seconds later the door opened. Before her stood a tall man, about 40 years old. He wore a simple shirt, but his posture and his gaze carried a natural confidence. Yet in his eyes there was also something else, tiredness. "Helen?" he asked. "Yes, I came about the ad," she replied with a slight smile. "Come in," he said, opening the door wider. "I'm Andrew." The inside of the house was as elegant as she had imagined. Modern furniture, light-colored walls, and large paintings decorating the living room. Everything was perfectly neat, and still there was a strange quietness, as if that place were too silent. "My son is 7 years old," Andrew explained as they walked toward the living room. "His name is Matthew." At that moment the boy appeared from the hallway. He had dark hair, a little messy, and he was holding a tablet in his hands. He barely looked up. "Matthew, say hello," Andrew said in a calm voice. The boy glanced at her for just an instant. "Hi," he murmured. "Hi, Matthew," Helen replied warmly. But he immediately went back to focusing on the screen and sat on the sofa. Helen noticed something in his attitude. He did not seem shy, but distant. "The job is simple," Andrew continued. "I need someone to be with him after school. I work a lot and I can't always get home early." "I understand," Helen answered. Andrew watched her for a few seconds as if making an internal decision. "If you want, you can start tomorrow." Helen was surprised by how quickly everything was happening, but she also felt relief. "Of course, I would love to." The next day she started. The first days were a bit uncomfortable. Matthew spoke little and spent most of his time with the tablet or watching television. Helen tried to talk with him, but she almost always got short answers, until one afternoon she decided to try something different. "Matthew, do you like to draw?" she asked, pulling out some colored pencils she had bought. The boy looked up with curiosity. "A little." "Then let's try something," she said, smiling. They sat together at the kitchen table and began to draw. At first Matthew stayed quiet, but little by little he focused on his paper. "What are you making?" Helen asked. "A dog," he answered. "It looks really good." For the first time, Matthew smiled slightly. That small moment changed something between the two of them. As the weeks passed, the boy started to talk more. They played in the nearby park, did homework together, and sometimes even baked cookies in the kitchen. However, Helen also began to notice something else. Every time Andrew came home from work, the atmosphere changed. He always seemed exhausted, as if he carried an invisible sadness on his shoulders. One night, while Helen was preparing dinner for Matthew, Andrew came into the kitchen. "Smells really good," he commented. "It's only pasta," she replied with a smile. There was a brief pause. "Matthew talks a lot more now," Andrew said at last. "He's a good kid. He just needed a little company." Andrew nodded slowly. "Since you arrived, this house feels different." Helen did not know what to answer. Days later something happened that surprised her. They were drawing when Matthew looked up. "Helen, did you also end up alone?" She frowned a little. "Why do you ask that?" The boy looked down at the paper. "Because Dad says Mom isn't coming back." Helen felt a knot in her chest. She did not know exactly what had happened with Matthew's mother, but it was clear that her absence had left a deep wound. "Sometimes people leave," she said gently. "But that doesn't mean we will be alone forever." Matthew looked at her. "Really?" Helen smiled. "Really?" The boy smiled too and kept drawing. That night, when Andrew came home, he found Matthew laughing in the living room while Helen ran after him, playing. The man stood still for a few seconds in the doorway, watching the scene. It had been a long time since he had heard that laugh. Later, when Matthew was already asleep, Andrew spoke with Helen in the kitchen. "Thank you," he said suddenly. She looked at him, surprised. "Why?" My son hadn't smiled like that in a long time. Helen lowered her gaze. "Kids just need to feel loved." Andrew watched her with a thoughtful expression. For the first time in a long time, that big, silent house was beginning to feel like a real home. The months passed almost without Helen noticing. What at first had been a temporary job slowly became an essential part of her life. The routine of the house changed completely. The afternoons were no longer filled with silence but with laughter, schoolwork, games, and simple conversations. Matthew no longer spent all his time in front of the screen. Now he waited eagerly for the moment Helen would pick him up from school. "Helen, today I got the highest grade in math," he shouted one afternoon, running toward her with his backpack bouncing on his back. "That's wonderful," she answered, lifting him off the ground a little. "We'll have to celebrate with cookies." "Lots and lots of cookies," Matthew laughed. Andrew also started to notice those changes. Every time he came home from work, He found his son happier, more confident. And without realizing it, he too began to look forward to seeing Helen. One night after dinner, Matthew fell asleep while they were trying to watch a movie. Helen covered him with a blanket and Andrew watched her in silence. "It used to be noisy here too," he said finally, "but it was different." Helen looked at him with curiosity. "What do you mean?" Andrew leaned back in the chair. "When my wife left, everything changed. Matthew stopped talking so much, and I hid in work." Helen listened closely. "I thought that by working more I could fix everything, but really I only drifted away from my own son." There was a brief pause. "And then you appeared," he continued. "You didn't do anything extraordinary. You simply were here." Helen smiled gently. Sometimes being present is the most important thing. Andrew looked at her for a few seconds as if he wanted to say something more, but he chose to stay silent. The weeks went on. On an autumn Sunday, Helen decided to take Matthew to the park. The leaves on the trees were changing color and covered the ground in shades of red, yellow, and gold. Matthew ran along the path chasing a ball while Helen and Andrew walked behind him. "A year ago," Helen said suddenly, "I thought my life had ended." Andrew looked at her. "Because of the wedding?" Helen nodded. "That day I thought I had lost everything. I felt humiliated, sad, as if no one could really love me." Andrew was quiet for a moment. Sometimes life breaks our plans, but that doesn't always mean something bad. At that moment Matthew came running back to them. "Look what I found." In his hands he carried a bright red leaf that looked almost golden under the sunlight. "It's beautiful," Helen said. "I'm going to keep it," the boy replied proudly, and ran off again, leaving the two adults walking slowly behind him. Andrew took a deep breath. "Helen, I want to tell you something." She looked at him. "When I hired you, I only needed a babysitter. But now I don't want you here just for work." Helen frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Andrew spoke with sincerity. "I want you to stay because you're already part of this family." Helen's heart began to beat faster. "Andrew, I don't expect you to answer now," he added calmly. "I just wanted you to know how important you are to us." Helen looked at Matthew, who was playing in the distance. The boy was laughing as he tried to catch the ball among the fallen leaves. Months ago she had walked out of a church feeling that her life had collapsed. Now she was there, in the middle of a park full of life, next to two people who looked at her with affection, and she understood something she had not understood before. Many times what seems like a painful ending is nothing more than a new beginning in disguise. She smiled softly. "I don't think I want to leave," she said at last. Andrew smiled too, and for the first time in a long time, his gaze no longer looked tired. Matthew ran toward them again. "Let's play." "Of course," Helen answered, laughing. The three of them ran among the leaves in the park while the afternoon sun lit the path. And in that instant, Helen understood something important about life. Sometimes love does not come with big promises or perfect plans. Sometimes it shows up in the most unexpected places, when we help others heal, and without realizing it, we begin to heal ourselves too. Moral: life does not always follow the path we imagine. Sometimes a great disappointment opens the door to something more real, more peaceful, and more beautiful than we had ever dreamed.